Hello, welcome to Module 7, Bindery Operations. In this lecture here, we'll look at some of the basic bindery operations that you should be aware of when it comes to planning out print production projects. On this screen here, we have a photo of a guillotine cutter. We all saw one of these in action at Lithex when we were on the tour. And you can see the operator there putting paper underneath the knife blade, and they're using a metal or a plastic block to jog all the paper squarely together. But if you recall, these cutters can cut through hundreds of sheets of paper very precisely and just cut through like butter. So pretty neat machines. Anyhow, the bindery is a part of the printing plant that does everything after the stuff has been printed. So there's a press room where the printing presses are, and then after the sheets have been printed, they need to be cut and folded and stamped and laminated and glued. And so there's a variety of things that happen, and they generally call that the bindery. Normally it was for binding into books, book binding, but bindery has become a generic term for anything that happens to the printed material after it's been printed. So we're going to look at some of these here in a little more detail. And the first thing is folding. Folding is, along with cutting, is the most common operation in the bindery. We got to see a folder in operation at Lithex, and it looked similar to this one down here. Oops, sorry, I'm going to go back. It looks similar to this photo down here. And it's a buckle folder. So here's a diagram of a buckle folder here, to where the sheet comes in, hits this buckle, hits that stop, and it makes the paper buckle, and these rollers grab it and pull it through, which folds it. So that's similar to another type, is where the sheet comes by and a little knife will jab it down into the roller. That's a knife folder. But we had the chance to see the buckle folder there. This picture over here is of a web press folding newspapers while it's running. So the newspapers get printed on a web press, and then they get folded and then sent to the cutter. When it comes to folding thicker paper, like cover stock or card stock and so on, first the paper needs to be scored or creased, and so a small metal blade will come in and indent the paper, and that allows the paper to fold without cracking. It allows it to fold with a nice straight line in the right spot. Folding thicker paper, cardstock, cover stock, can be a little tricky, so they put in these scoring and folding marks to help them before they fold. They could also run these score and creasing stamps even for flat paper that is intended to be folded later by the customer or the user. Similar to that is the perforator. So it's just the same type of blade, but it has these little tiny spaces between the sharp blades, so that it cuts in and creates perforation. And they can make that space a lot smaller and make it tiny, almost like little pins, to create little tiny dots we call micro-perf. And you usually see that on like bills that you might get in the mail, where you have to tear off a part to send back. But other perforations, bigger ones for card stocks that you might see in magazines and other marketing materials. So this is a diagram of basic folds, and you can see there's a variety of them, and it is kind of endless too. They create new folding patterns depending on how they're going to be engineered by the designer and the bindery. So you could come up with your own creative fold and then have to work it out with a bindery to get engineered. But essentially, these ones in the red rectangles, I'd like you to focus on remembering what they are, what they're called, and the difference between them. So here we have our basic letter folds and roll folds, to where we could just fold a paper in half, and we call that a 4-page fold because there's a front and back of page 1 and a front and back of the second page. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4. You fold it 3 times like a regular brochure, and you've got a 6-page. So in Bindery they'd call that a 6-page, because everywhere there's a fold that would divide it into pages. Then you have a front and back. However, this is the accordion style fold, so rather than a roll fold like this, or letter fold, you would fold it in that way to make it more like an accordion. And then an 8-page here, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and they each have front and back. They are just folded parallel twice. A gatefold, which is great for books and publications, to where you might open up a book and then open up a larger gate. So you can just remember that as it opens like a gate. And then the accordion, you can see here's an 8-page accordion, and it's just a matter of adding more panels. So the longer the sheet, you could have a 16-page accordion or a 12-page accordion, and so on. So you can see that this is a roll fold here. This is a accordion fold, gate fold. There's an 8-page roll, and so on. But just focus on the ones in the red. You'll be good. Other operations that happen in the Bindery are, like for instance, our lamination. Lamination is applying a plastic coating to the paper. So it is a thick plastic coating that is applied by heat glued. You generally need to score that before you fold those. It protects against dirt and humidity and wear and tear. You're probably pretty familiar with lamination. Varnish is a similar treatment. It's putting down a clear liquid, ink type liquid, but it's clear, and it does the same thing. It protects the material, or it can apply different sorts of finishes to it, like glossy or satin finishes. Many varnishes are applied on the printing press directly at the same time. So it could be a printing press operation, but there's also varnishing that happens in the Bindery too, to get different results. For instance, UV varnishes usually go through a separate machine because they need a ultraviolet light to cure the varnish. And this other option here, the oil print varnish, is kind of shown in this image here, to where you would apply the varnish just in certain areas, and you come up with an effect just because of the gloss varnish compared to the dull background. So whenever you cover a whole sheet with varnish, they call that a flood varnish, and it just covers the whole sheet. But if you want to cover just certain areas, like these circles on this printed piece here, then that would be a spot varnish, and you as the designer would have to draw or create the art that would create the varnish layer. So it's a way of doing an extra layer on top of your artwork that might trace these circles. Or if you were varnishing on top of photographs, you'd have to get the shape of the photograph, whether it's a rectangle or a circular, and you would have to create a separate plate that is a varnish plate that would have the shape that would line up directly on top of your art to create the varnish effect. So a good combination is to have a dull background, and then you use a spot, a dull flood varnish, so cover the whole thing with dull varnish, and then you put on a spot varnish of gloss, and then that creates a high contrast effect. It's not too expensive. It's pretty modern, neat effect. Another operation is die cutting. Die cutting. A die is a metal razor blade shape that will cut the paper into shapes. So it might be the top of a piece of paper or an edge. You could cut holes through the paper. Any paper that's got an interesting shape to it was printed as a normal piece of paper, but then run through a die cutting machine, which stamps out and cuts off the edges of the paper or cuts the holes through the paper. So it's just a term. The die is the metal blade, And here we have a photo. There's a metal, this is the metal blade. And then along the blade are these foam rubber pieces. We saw this at Lithex also, if you recall. And the foam rubber pushes the paper back off the die after it's been stamped in there. So if you stamp a paper in there and you didn't have the foam, your paper would get stuck in these little holes. Well, the foam rubber helps push the paper back off. And it helps the operator know where the blade is and can help you from getting your fingers cut too. So dies are not that expensive, and there's a lot of pre-made dies, like for rounded corners and business cards and so forth. But you can create custom shaped dies, and the bindery usually sends out to somebody who makes the dies, and then they send the die back to the bindery, hook it up to their machine, and they start stamping it out. Not all binderies have all the right equipment, so some binderies might not have die cutting capability, and they would have to send it to a different bindery that does. Similar to die cutting is embossing, and another term called debossing. So an emboss is when the image is raised up on the paper, and a deboss is when the image is pressed down into the paper. And both of these work with two metal dies. So you have two dies, and they kind of sandwich the paper between them to create the shape. So you can use text, you can use artwork and other creative designs to create custom embossing and debossing. But it gets a little more expensive, and you have to be using the right type of papers and materials, and that usually goes through when you're talking with your print salesperson and you're talking about doing an embossed job. Then when it comes to choosing your paper stock, that becomes part of the conversation. You get limited on what types of papers work better with embossing and debossing. So it's always worth a conversation, and it's the combination of your paper stock and the bindery equipment what works best with them. So it'll be different for each bindery. Another process is called thermography, and this is an interesting process to where you have a slow drying ink applied, and then a thermography is where you have this texture on the paper, and the texture is part of the ink, and it kind of feels like an embossing, but when you flip the paper over, you see it's not the paper being pushed up. It's like there's some stuff on the paper to give it a texture. So thermography is what that is. And that's where you have the ink is put down, and then this powder gets put onto the sheet, and it sticks to the ink, and then you vacuum off the rest of the powder, apply some heat, and it makes the powder kind of grow and create this texture. And then you have a texturized paper on just like on an image or on the title, on specific areas of your design. So you have to shop around for that and ask binderies if they do thermography, or they might know somebody who does, and they have to send out and get it done. Another operation is foil stamping. Foil stamping is not too expensive either. You do have to create a metal die, and you do use some foil material, and it kind of works similar to embossing. It's just that the metal stamp presses a foil onto your paper or whatever the surface is that you're stamping onto. So with a combination of heat and pressure, it applies a foil with it, and you can also combine it with an emboss or deboss, so that it could be a raised up image with foil on top of it. A lot of times it's used just for lettering, but it can also be used for simple shapes. Foil stamping, you don't really get photographic detail, and you can't use halftones with it, so it's really solid linear graphic type shapes that you get foil stamped. I will show you examples of all these in the class, and just to let you know, there are a lot more bindery operations out there. This is just a sample of some of them, new processes are being invented all the time, new materials, new technologies, and so it's a pretty interesting and changing field. So I'd implore you to research more if you are interested. Thank you.